So, I'm going to talk to you about the history of the croissant and the baguette. That is, the two most iconic French breads. And these are so well known that you might even think that's all there is to French bread history, that forever the two French breads have been the croissant and the baguette. But in fact, even though each goes back over 100 years, they are relatively recent arrivals in French bread history, which does go back 2,000 years after all. So let's start with the croissant. And I'm going to start with two things which are not true. I'm going to start with them because if you haven't heard them already, you probably will. One is a claim that the kipfel, which is the Austrian model for the croissant, was invented at a siege of Vienna in 1683. And the gist of this tale goes that the Viennese bakers were working late, as bakers will, and they heard Turks tunneling under the walls. They gave the alarm, and they were granted the right to make a pastry in the shape of the Turkish crescent. We know this isn't true. We know it isn't true, first of all, because the kipfel had been around for centuries before that and is specifically documented just before that as existing in a number of shapes, one of which was a crescent. And then perhaps more particularly, we know it isn't true because if you look at any normal history of Vienna or of the siege of Vienna, you won't find this story. It's only in cooking and baking texts. Now, I actually have a kind of affection for the next myth because it made me a bread historian. Years ago, I was writing a paper on breakfast in 18th century France, and I just naturally assumed I would include the fact that Marie Antoinette had brought the croissant to Paris. Only I looked through all kinds of 18th century documents, couldn't find any reference to the croissant or anything like it. Moved to the start of the 19th century, still nothing. And finally, it was 1850 before I found any reference to the croissant in France. And at the time, a friend said, well, you know, if it's in print starting in 1850, it probably came along around 10 years before that. And he wasn't far off, in fact. So, who did bring the croissant to Paris? As it turns out, a former artillery officer, an Austrian gentleman named August Zang. August Zang was the son of a very famous surgeon, and apparently was something of a disappointment to his father, and seems to have tried to prove himself to his father, even as will happen after his father died. He speculated in real estate. That didn't go very far. He invented a gun, but it didn't have that much success. By one account, and we really don't know if this is true, but supposedly he came to Paris, didn't like the bread, and French bread had gone down somewhat since the Revolution. And he thought, well, what the French need is good Viennese bread. And Viennese bread was very good at this point, for a number of reasons, not least because it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Hungarian flour was the best in Europe, but there are other reasons, as we'll see. So around 1837 or 1838, he and a partner bought a bakery on the Rue de Richelieu and founded the first Boulangerie Viennoise in Paris, the first Viennese bakery. Now, if you go to the Rue de Richelieu today, it's not that impressive a street. You'd probably go there because you're on your way to or back from the Palais Royal. It runs right along the Palais Royal. But there's very little there besides some coin dealers, some wine bars. At the start of the 19th century, it was probably the most elegant street in Paris. Balzac had a pied-à-terre there. There was another famous bakery on the street. There were music publishers, which is how Wagner met Berlioz, on the Rue de Richelieu. And it really seemed like a very good place to open an upscale bakery. but the French didn't care. They showed no interest in such appetizing Austrian specialties as the kipfel, the Kaisersemmel, which was in fact the Kaiser roll, but back then was a much finer kind of roll. These were the two main rolls in Austrian baking, not the Linzer torte, which was already being made. And so things looked bad. But the bakery was in the same building as La Presse, which was the first French penny press. Today, we take it for granted that when you buy a newspaper, it will be cheap because it's financed mainly by advertising. But this was a new idea in 19th century France, and Émile Dujardin became very rich implementing it. Zang took the hint, and in November of 1839, a very flattering item appeared in La Presse regarding the Boulangerie Viennoise. It was almost certainly paid, although it's not presented as an ad. And the next thing you know, the bakery was a huge success. Later, the bakery would say that it was founded in 1840, but in fact, we know there was a big opening or reopening in November 1839. Now, the bakery had a number of things going for it. One is if you look at old French bakeries, here's one from the 18th century, you see they had bars on the windows, wooden shelves. They just were very functional looking places, and apparently were still that way at the start of the 19th century. But Zang opened an Austrian-style bakery with Austro-Hungarian elegance, with marble countertops and brass fittings, mirrors, mosaics. By all accounts, it was a very elegant place. And as French bakers began to imitate his bakery, and they actually opened Viennese bakeries, so-called, they also imitated the decor, and soon other bakeries too had very elegant decor. So here we have a 19th century French bakery from after Zang, and you see there's a big marble counter. There are very tall windows, no reflections of bars here, a beautiful decoration of some sort on the ceiling. And you can still see some of these beautiful old 19th century French bakeries in Paris today. Often they've become clothing stores because the decor is so pretty. You won't find many that are still bakeries, but there's a few scattered around, and this goes back to August Zang. Zang's bread became so popular that he decided to mark it, and so he actually embossed his name in the bread. Got mocked for this a little bit, but in fact, for centuries, French bakers have been obliged to put at least their mark on their bread. Still, people didn't generally put their whole names on it, so that was an innovation. And the bread at the bakery became so popular that soon French bakeries divided their bread into pain français, which was made with sourdough and some water, whereas the pain viennois was made with a little milk and yeast, and these became two standard sorts of bread in Paris. The big technical innovation that the bakery introduced came from the Viennese habit of leaving a little water in the oven after you cleaned it so that steam formed in the oven. The steam would fall on the baking bread and melt a kind of powder that formed on the top of the baking bread, the dextrine, and that created a glaze. You probably have seen that glaze. You may not have noticed it, but if you look at a baguette, it's got a kind of shiny surface, which is a result of a steam oven. And if you look at Julia Child's instructions for making a baguette, she actually tells you how to create steam in the oven, which goes directly back to August Zang. And in fact, soon French inventors were creating what they called Viennese ovens. The Viennese didn't, and they put steam in the oven. He also advertised that his bread was untouched by human hands. And one result of that was that he made a bread using the dough from the Kaisersemmel. And in fact, it was the same dough at this point for the kipfel, but in a mechanical kind of rectangular shape. Now, when French bakers began to imitate this, they just made it by hand, and they made it in all kinds of shapes, and they called it a Viennese loaf, a pain viennois. And it became very popular in Paris. If you were living well, you ate pain viennois. But the kipfel also became popular, and when French bakers made it, since it was shaped like a crescent, they called it a crescent, which in French is croissant. It became so popular that when a man wrote a whole survey of local rolls from different regions, he complained these are all disappearing because today everybody just makes croissant. Now, 1848 came along, and there were revolutions all over Europe, including in Vienna. So freedom of the press came to Austria, and Zang sold his bakery, whipped back to Vienna, and ended up founding a newspaper with the same name as his neighbor, but in German, Die Presse. And you can still buy Die Presse today because Zang transformed the Austrian press. And in fact, one American newspaper called him the father of the Viennese press. And so the same man transformed French baking and the Viennese press, which is very impressive, don't you think? Meanwhile, the croissant had been made in two different shapes or sizes, but it was basically made in the same way as a nice piece of bread with some milk in it, and glazed, of course, because of the Austrian steam. For reasons we don't know, about 20 years before the end of the century, you begin to see recipes where you roll the dough out flat, and then you roll butter across it, and then you roll it up. And when you do that, you get something called puff pastry, or in French, leafed dough, pâte feuilletée. More technically, this is known as laminated dough, which basically means exactly the same thing, dough in leaves. And as they continued to do this, they put yeast in this puff pastry and then later added milk and other ingredients. So today we call this croissant dough, and it's not quite the same as puff pastry, but it's based on puff pastry, which for centuries had been a French method. It was probably an Arab method originally. And by the start of the 20th century, the croissant was most often made with this laminated dough, and there were more and more layers to it, which is why we have this nice flaky croissant you know today. There were all kinds of ways of making croissant, including the old one. In fact, in the 30s, one manual included 30 different ways of making croissant. So if you really want to make croissant, you can go to town if you read French. Meanwhile, a word appeared which meant light, graceful things from Vienna, like a Strauss waltz, for instance. And this word was Viennoiserie. We don't know why this word was finally applied to the croissant or exactly when, but it was. And then other pastries, like the pain au chocolat, which is basically some chocolate wrapped in croissant dough, began to be included under this heading. And today there's a whole range of viennoiserie. You'll actually see definitions of viennoiserie which say that it's Vienna-style baked goods. But in fact, it's not Viennese style at all. The only thing Viennese about it is a croissant. But the method used for most viennoiserie is French. It's the croissant dough, which again is based on puff pastry. And it's also true that today you can go to Vienna and you can buy a croissant, and you can still buy a kipfel. And so you see the French pastry, roll, whatever, next to its ancestor. And the croissant, originally Austrian, has become completely French. Now let's look at the baguette. And of course, the baguette too has its myths. Most baked goods do. One is that Napoleon's soldiers needed a long bread they could put down their pants legs while they were marching. Now, if you trust this myth at all, I advise you to buy a cheap baguette and try putting it down your pants leg. You won't get very far. If you don't want to go to that extent, here's an image of some Napoleonic soldiers. You can see they had rather tight pants. not really great for putting baguettes down. And when they wanted to carry something long, like a sword, they used a scabbard. Not to mention that the baguette didn't come along till much later. There's another myth which is actually pretty popular among some bread historians and bakers, and that's the claim that the baguette is not French at all, but a foreign innovation. And as it happens, who do they credit with introducing it? Why, once again, August Zang. This appears to be due to a misunderstanding. Today's pain viennois looks very much like a baguette. It's a long, narrow bread. And of course, we know Zang did introduce the pain viennois. But the pain viennois in the 19th century didn't look anything like a baguette. There's no evidence that the Austrians had anything like a baguette at the time, nor that Zang introduced any long, narrow breads. Not to mention that the French had had long, narrow breads for a long time before Zang came to Paris. So let's go back in French bread history. And I'm sure you've seen images like this of little spherical breads, what the French call the boule. For over a millennium, French bread was most typically made in this form, or when it got bigger, it collapsed into a kind of hemisphere. But generally, sort of spherical, hemispherical breads were the norm in France for a very long time. There were other shapes, but these were the main ones. You get to the 17th century, and Parisian bread, at least, changed quite a bit. For one thing, for some reason, Parisian bakers began to make small, luxurious breads using milk and yeast. In fact, very much like the later Viennese breads. And these were not regulated in the same way that the standard sourdough loaves were, so they became known as pain de fantaisie. That is, they were made according to the fantasy of the baker. And since they weren't regulated, the baker could charge what he or she wanted. And of course, bakers like that. And the concept of pain de fantaisie would last for quite a while in France, although it had different specific meanings at different moments. Now, it appears that the fact that more and more soft breads are made, because the yeast leavened bread tended to be softer, the old French bread had been made with hard dough, pâte ferme, and had a very hard inside crumb. But now French bakers began to make even the ordinary bread with a dough that was neither soft nor hard. It was bastard dough, midway between the two. And when you did that, you got an inside that didn't have anything like the same purchase, something to bite down on that you did with the old hard dough. So bakers began to bring the sides of the bread together. Now, another thing that was true is that crust had never been important in French bread. When you see earlier descriptions of good bread, it never mentions a crust. But now the crust became more and more important as the two sides came together, and this made the bread hard on the outside where it had been more hard on the inside before. By the middle of the 18th century, this had become the standard shape for a bread, and bread writers would talk about the old boule and say, well, this is how we used to make bread, but today it's the long, narrow shape that dominates. One of these writers complained that it had become so long and narrow it was like a flute, and that some breads were nothing but crust. This particular writer was August Zang, whose name you may know because he did, of course, promote the potato. But he promoted the potato largely because he was studying bread and he wanted to try and make bread from the potato. Failed at that completely, but made the potato very popular. You get to the start of the 19th century, and a food critic praised the flute from a famous bakery. And at this point, he's using flute as a noun. The term would be used all through the 19th century to refer to long, narrow breads, not necessarily a specific one, because a lot of them had their own specific names. There was a flute soup, which was a small, narrow roll, all crust, which you could put into soup. But in general, the long, narrow shape had become pretty standard. Now, About the time that Zang opened his bakery, a new development occurred, and we don't know exactly when or why, but Parisian bakers began to make very long breads that American tourists described as being like crowbars. And they were 2 meters long. They were really, really long. Some were wider than others. They came in different shapes. But one in particular was almost like a giant baguette. It was a very long bread with slashes on the front. And that is something that only came along at the start of the 19th century. It didn't used to have slashes on bread in France. And it could also be made 3 feet long, in which case it looked almost exactly like a baguette. Here we have a young American tourist discovering French bread for the first time. What he's holding is probably a jacco. Now, if you're thinking it would have been hard to go do your evening shopping and have to carry this kind of bread home, well, usually you didn't, because since the 18th century, there had been these women called porteuses de pain, female bread porters. And there were male bread porters, but far fewer of them. The female bread porters, the porteuses de pain, had very hard lives, and they would carry their breads in their aprons or in little carts. Or, as you can see here, they would carry the really long one sometimes on a rack. And if you're thinking, well, that looks really heavy, yeah, it was probably very heavy. But nobody cared because these women were treated virtually as beasts of burden. Never mind what a woman had to deal with trying to deliver bread to single men at the time. So, meanwhile, you did have the 3-foot long jacco, and here you have a woman carrying what was probably a jacco. As you can see, it looks a lot like a baguette. Then we have this image of various breads from the 19th century, and all the way to the left, you have what looks very much like a baguette, but in fact is labeled a white pain de fantaisie, a fantasy bread. And you're probably wondering, well, you said that the pain de fantaisie was a category of breads. Yep, it was. But it was also used for a while to refer to a specific loaf. It's important to bear in mind that terms for bread in France were not officially set for a long time. They just kind of grew up, and this is what happens when you let terms just grow up. Now, was the pain de fantaisie in fact a 3-foot long jacco? Maybe. I mean, that's my belief, but I've never seen any specific evidence to that effect. So, we get to the start of the 20th century, and in 1902, an Austrian baker named Emil Braun put out a book on European bread with all kinds of really nice images of breads from all over Europe, and it includes this image of 2 very narrow breads, and he calls these French sticks. Regrettably, he doesn't give the French name for these, but one word for stick in French is baguette, which can also mean a baton or a wand. And it is very likely that these were baguettes. And as you can see, they're very, very skinny. They really are like sticks. So one question that comes up is, why did French bakers, after all this time of making long, narrow bread, suddenly make a bread that almost literally was a stick? We don't know. Not a clue. It's so rarely discussed, even as we see the baguette becoming a standard bread. It's so rare to see any reference to it at all. About a year later, a Parisian baker also put out a manual on baking, and he gives instructions for 2 different kinds of baguettes. One is about 100 grams. Now that was probably a breadstick, because the term baguette was sometimes used for a glissini. We call it a stick too, breadstick. But then there's another that was 200 and some grams, and that was probably more like the baguette we just saw, a much bigger bread, may even been somewhat like the modern baguette, for all we know. We get to 1913, and here is this image of breads that were popular in Paris. And you may be thinking that first bread in looks a lot like a baguette, because it does, but it's not. It's a jacco. It's the bread all the way to the left, the really narrow, skinny one, which is the baguette. And again, this shows that the baguette was solidly established by 1913, that it was a very skinny bread. It really did look like a stick, a baguette. But it's very rare to see any reference to it. You'll see all kinds of references to a lot of these other breads. You'll see images of them. It's very rare to see a mention of the baguette. We get to World War I, there's all kinds of limits on breads, and the poor Parisians had to eat dark bread, which they hated. They didn't care there was a war on. They wanted to eat white bread. Tough luck. So we get to 1917, and the French not only are eating dark bread, they're probably not eating baguettes because most of the long, narrow breads were banned at this point. And yet somehow a journalist from the New York Times got a recipe for the baguette, or what he calls the French stick. This is certainly the first recipe we have in English. It may be the first recipe full stop. Certainly it's a very rare recipe of any sort for the baguette, and it shows that New Yorkers cared about the baguette enough that it was worth introducing them to this recipe. It also shows, of course, that the French were very familiar with it since he was able to get the recipe. But again, it's a very rare mention in the first 2 decades of the 20th century of the baguette. The war ends, it's 1920, but the French still have to eat dark bread. Until July 1920, when a writer in the Figaro exuberantly announced we shall once again be allowed to eat the good white bread. And the joy is almost palpable. Then a month later, there's a list of prices of 4 different breads. Why these particular breads were chosen isn't really clear because they're not necessarily the most common breads. But the 4th is the baguette, having a minimum weight of 80 grams and a maximum length of 40 centimeters. So this was still a skinny baguette. It's a very skinny baguette. A year later, there was another law which defined a baguette of 100 grams, still pretty skinny, and another of 300 grams, which was the standard weight of a baguette for a long time. Today it tends to be 250. So the baguette was established. It seems to have shifted in size for a while. Now we know that after a time, it took on what we think of as the baguette shape today, and what again looks very much like the Jacco of the 19th century in its shorter form. Why did it go from really looking like a stick to looking more like an old Jacco? Don't know. There is no hint of the process, and in fact, again, the baguette is barely mentioned. It would be past 1930 before a dictionary defined baguette as a bread. It already defined it as a baton or even as a type of diamond, but not as a bread. Meanwhile, in 1922, an American magazine compared a rolled up newspaper to a French baguette, so clearly it was pretty well known to Americans at this point. Now we have this image from 1922, that is well after the baguette has been officially mentioned. It shows common Parisian breads, and once again, no baguette. There's one bread that you could imagine might be a baguette, but nothing labeled a baguette. Again, why did it take so long to mention this bread that has proved so important in France? We don't know. But that is how the croissant came to Paris and how the baguette came to Paris, and I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you.